right, welcome to the Simple Talk podcast. I'm Steve Jones from Redgate Software, and I have over here Ryan.
Ryan Booz, Redgate Software.
And over here,
Grant Fritchie, Redgate Software.
We are the three advocates.
The three advocates. There we
I
go.
feel like
Right.
I couldn't find a cowboy hat that fit.
Yeah, we stole these from we're down in Austin making this recording. So for this episode, we're database people, we're pros. We wanted to talk a little bit about SQL Server and Postgres and the differences. So I've been a SQL Server for most of my career. I've used different platforms, but primarily SQL Server. Grant's been mostly SQL Server, moving to Postgres in the last few years.
Not moving to, adding.
Yeah. And Ryan was SQL Server and actually moved to Postgres.
Full time.
Involuntarily,
yes.
And so we want to talk a little bit about maybe some of the differences and what it's like to change or work on both platforms. So should we start with your experience maybe? Because you've been at Postgres too long. Do you like Postgres more now than SQL Server? Same?
Yeah, so really interesting. That's a great question to start with, I think. My brief story is that I'd been SQL Server for about 15 years and really was, the platform was growing, Power BI, all the stuff. I was really excited about doing more big data and decided to switch companies after 15 years. And I thought that they were using SQL Server and we were talking about machine learning, we were talking about all this stuff. And I finally decided to take the job, but I gave my old employer a month just because I had so much history with them. And in all that, this was like 3 months of conversation. And nowhere in that did someone say, by the way, we're working as hard as we can to get away from SQL Server. And so by the time you show up, we will be all Postgres. And so no one told me that. And so I showed up and literally it was day one, open computer, log in, try and get stuff set up. And then, hey, where's the connection string? And someone sends it to me in Slack and I'm like,
what the heck is this?
That's not a SQL Server connection string. They said, well, yeah, we're using Postgres now. What? That is not what we agreed to here. So, I would say what I just recently told someone is I spent a year at that company. It was a real-time data analytics company, hundreds of thousands of sensors sending data in every 5 seconds, 10 seconds. And I tried every way I could to figure out how to convince them to go back to SQL Server. Because the app wasn't terribly well set up. We've talked about inexperience, right? So it was a lot of more inexperienced developers who were. It was a startup. They were trying to get this thing rolling. And so I tried every way to convince them, and we could do this better if it was in SQL Server, and we could. In about the year mark, what really changed for me is I finally started to find community in Postgres. And so my frustration with Postgres was that I didn't have a community to help me understand what I didn't understand. Right? Like, I have the question, and I don't know how to find it. Right. And once I started to find that community, my view towards Postgres started to change.
So now you prefer Postgres?
I really do.
Okay.
I prefer Postgres.
Good. And so Grant, for you, it's been a year and a half, 2 years?
About 2 years, yeah.
2 years.
About 2 years now. Wow, gosh.
And so how do you compare the two platforms? What do you think about them? Like if you had to do something new today, what would you do it in?
Wow, oh God, now that's a setup. All right, so I'll say this. If we went back in time and I was a young lad, if I were involved with a startup today, I would put them on Postgres.
Mm-hmm. What about if you went back to the insurance company you worked at? Would you stick with SQL Server or say we should think about Postgres? Or we just go?
Well, I happen to know the insurance company is moving to Postgres.
Well,
no, I would argue that they should stay on SQL Server. SQL Server is a fantastic tool. It just is. It's just a fantastic tool. Postgres is a fantastic tool.
Yep.
They both are. If you've already got applications, databases, knowledge, skills, disaster recovery, you've built an infrastructure around SQL Server, I wouldn't leave it.
Yep.
I just wouldn't leave it. It's not that I'm not saying, this one thing, geospatial, that's one, is going to be better in Postgres. Mm-hmm. It is.
It is.
It is. It's going to be better in Postgres. But SQL Server does geospatial.
Ish.
And ish, sort of. But all of the rest of the stuff that you have, it's not a reason to leave. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's maybe you add it because you need the geospatial.
Right.
But boy, yeah, I would argue against migrating unless there's just an overwhelming and overriding reason to go, and I don't see it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm a big fan of inertia and sticking with what you have, but it's mostly because of staff and knowledge.
Yep.
That's my view. Like, I've rarely seen a customer move database platforms that saw value from that move. Now, if you have a big Postgres staff and a SQL Server staff, maybe there's some value in moving one way or the other, but often changing database platforms has not added any value for most applications, right?
Well, the value that's perceived currently is that you're going to gain value by simply saving money.
Right.
Yeah,
It's-
I mean,
it's that
licensing.
Because
financial-
licensing costs go away.
Right, but you really think about your licensing and think about the cost of your labor, because most of us in the technical space don't deal with cost of labor.
Absolutely.
But when you look at cost of labor and salary, like, you can evaporate licensing for many years very quickly in doing that. So, but aside from that, let's compare them a little bit. So, what do you like about Postgres? Like, give me this example of something that works, you see working really well in Postgres.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so what is something, time series?
So I'll start with extensibility, because that allows us to do, to use the database in many different ways, whether it be through storage, whether it be through, so time series is a good example. I'll start with timescale because that was a timescale, right? So it's an extension that allows Postgres to become a time series database. And time series is really specific, and it's most of what we do now, right? Like,
I don't know about that.
well,
Yeah,
but
I wouldn't make that right.
15 years ago, right? Like, every app I've ever worked on has been something about time series. But we would be like, oh my goodness, we have 5 million rows in a table in SQL Server. We have 10 million rows. Like, oh, we need to rethink how we're doing this. And you realize, like, now people are inserting 100 million rows a day, depending on what their platform is and what they're doing. And so I think
So
having
it's a plug-in
extensibility,
to the engine that lets you emulate a time series.
so it allows you to
streaming
store
data.
it, store it differently.
Right.
So it's more efficient how it's stored. It can be compressed, and then it can actually change the way that the query plan is developed. Is if you're doing this and this,
So if I'm
because
doing
you're joining two tables,
rolling windows or
Yep.
something, I can just do that stuff.
Like, there's a way for the extension to hook into the query planner and say, I know in this case this is going to be more efficient based on the calculation of the cost, and I'm going to use my own operator at that moment.
Right.
And,
Right.
I just think that stuff is really interesting.
So that's interesting extensibility, right? So you've worked in both space, right? In SQL Server, we have SQL CLR, which is extensibility-ish. Ish, right?
Ish.
Because we're limited in what we can extend.
I've seen CLR used well.
But do we?
But
I'd love to
it's,
hear that.
But it's
fairly
nowhere
niche.
near like the extensibility in Postgres, right?
No.
Because they can do way more.
They can do way more.
Because they can hook into different places, right? Our extensibility is limited to kind of objects in the schema that we could change.
Yes,
right?
yeah, it's very much, and data manipulation you can do. The successful ones that I saw were they were taking some really complex calculations.
Yeah, so financial calculation
Yeah,
stuff.
definitely
Yeah.
financial calculations. Throwing it into the code.
Yeah.
That
Yep.
did a good job with it, and then bringing it back to SQL Server, and it worked beautifully.
Yeah,
it
that
was
makes total sense.
gorgeous. It was a
Okay.
great solution. And I've seen it done badly, where people are trying to, more or less, we're just going to rewrite the database engine,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and you can't, because it's still there, and
Right.
your code sucks, and you've
And it
done-
doesn't work at scale, right?
Yeah,
across
yeah,
the
yeah,
browser.
you've done
I mean,
heinous things.
honestly,
Oh,
right?
yeah, yeah.
So
That's a good point.
the format statement in SQL Server is a .NET implementation of formatting.
Sure.
That really is very inefficient at scale, even though it's part of the language, right? Product. It just
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
work well,
Yeah.
So.
The other thing I as you asked, the one thing that's interesting, mostly because of extensions, but is indexing.
Right, so you
So
can
in
have different
Postgres, we
indexes.
have 6 or 7 standard type of indexes, not just B-tree and not just hash. We don't have column store by default, something like that. But guess what?
Coming.
There's an extension that you
Extension,
can
okay.
add, 2 or 3 that you can do column store indexes with. But then we have there's what they did, and same reason they did extensibility is they said we have unique kinds of data. You can create your own data types. You can whatever you need to do, and so we're going to create a framework. So if you know that data type or that data better than anybody else, you could create an index using a GIN or a GIST. It's a generalized index framework, and now you're indexing to do whatever you want. One example that people give is, hey, if you wanted, you could store images in a database, and you could have an index that indexes things like the brightness of the image or the objects
the
in the
metadata,
image,
like
the
I
metadata
did.
of the image,
Yeah,
things
that.
and it just becomes a new data type.
Yeah.
And so that's, it's just interesting to be able to do something like that as well. Just have that capability.
Yeah, and we don't have anything like that in SQL Server. The other thing you have the hypothetical index thing, right?
We do, which is really fun.
Which is really fascinating.
It's really fascinating.
Yeah, right. At the same time, in SQL Server, we have things like extended events.
I love extended events.
Right, I know you're right. And query
and
store,
there's not there in Postgres.
right?
It's just not.
We have, I think, in some sense,
We've got some amazing instrumentation. We have
some
fantastic
insights into what's happening
instrumentation.
that I think we've found is hard to do in other platforms.
Yes. Oh,
You know.
yes. I mean, I just did a webinar with Microsoft on Postgres, the extension that Microsoft has created in Azure for Postgres called Query Store.
Yeah.
Right.
Because they were, Microsoft was finding it hard to get instrumentation out of Postgres, so they went and built their own extension.
Yep.
So, I mean, it's...
And those are the kinds of things that I will say. The three things that still to this day, like it's just frustrating at times. Query Store was one. When I came over, to Postgres, and there is no cache of queries, right? We don't, we have pgstat statements, which lets us know historically over time what's happened, but
it's
there's
not
no
on by default. You have to turn that on.
And there's, we don't store the query plans. That's not a thing in Postgres unless you have an extension to do it.
Right.
Tooling.
Yeah, tooling was another thing I was going to say,
huge.
right?
Tooling is another one because it's open source. There are literally hundreds of tools, IDEs you can write SQL with. There's three or four or five that are popular.
Yes.
But everyone has a new take. And so because
good.
there's just a plethora, it's not the tool that the company, there's no company.
Yeah.
So it's not the tool that the company runs and they know everything and they're adding all these really useful things because it helps adoption.
Yes.
Right. And so I think tooling is just
Tooling is a big
challenge.
deal, right? And as much as we might complain about Management Studio, right, or ADS, it's worlds better than anything I've seen in the Oracle, Postgres, or MySQL space. Yeah. Like it's just better, despite its ugly flaws. Yeah, it's just
100%.
better. So all right. So instrumentation, right, of knowing what's going on. Tooling. HA.
Yeah, because I've got one.
So what's the HA story, right? Because it's fairly mature, I think, in SQL Server.
Well, I would say this. They're doing, how to answer that well. Doing HA is very, very capable. There's a lot of capability now, and there are, again, it's open source tools that allow you and help you to set it up. So it's not necessarily in Postgres. If I have to know all the commands to set up all the connections, do all the stuff, it's tedious. That's why having the tools help. But as I think we were just talking, what did we talk? Your article, part of the chapter you were writing the other day, we were talking about this and I was reviewing some stuff and the reality of, even to fail over and to do it well and properly, there is, without scripts, a lot of manual effort. You have to put a file somewhere, and it has to be named something, and it has to do this. And so,
there's certain recovery things that just
we'll get
to that in a second.
And that's what I've seen, right? Like I think when I've seen, so let me just take HI a little more broadly in that, not just disaster recovery, like failover of a cluster or a machine, but also replication type things, right? Where I'm moving data for purposes. It works well in Postgres, but it's a little brittle, more brittle than Microsoft's implementation, and even smart people struggle sometimes because of the complexity of so many things.
Complexity and going back to tooling, right?
And tooling.
All the things you need to know if it's working or if it's fit, they're there, but it's a query.
Yeah.
Or it's unless you have a tool that's going to let you know what's happening, easy to glance at and say, is that logical replication slot still working or not? Yeah,
when I read about it, right, like here's what it feels like, setting up a Windows SQL Server cluster on SQL Server 6.5. That's what it feels like. right? Which was a nightmare.
Oh, I remember that.
Right?
I've still got scar tissue. You want to see?
Right, it's a multi-day process. It feels arcane. It feels like we're casting spells.
Oh, yeah.
We have to have knowledge. That's what it feels like when I see some of the smart Postgres people write about the challenges of large-scale implementations. That if I didn't have that super smart individual, I'd be in trouble.
Well, I think that's true. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think that the strength of Postgres is also the weakness of Postgres. Yeah. The strength of it is that it's very developer focused. It's very developer driven, and it's object oriented in the way it's stored and the way you treat it, and all of that's good, right? All of that's good. But because it's so developer driven, it's so developer focused, they didn't think about HADR. I mean, because when was the last time a developer team, and I'm talking to you full stack developers, when was the last time developer teams said, oh, we might need to restore a backup because something might go wrong someday?
Yeah.
They don't think that way. And I'm not being critical. It's just the nature of the way.
It's the nature of how things happen.
Right, and to be fair, SQL Server looked like this 20 years ago, right?
Oh, God, yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
Or maybe not 20, but it's 25 years ago, right? Like if this feels late 90-ish database level for certain things, right? Some things certainly I think SQL Server could learn from it, or Oracle could learn from it, but some things are just immature.
They're immature, and so what's happened, and I've talked about this some, whether it's Microsoft, whether it's Amazon, Google, they are hitting these challenges, right? Amazon in RDS is the largest Postgres installation anywhere, right? They're running probably millions of Postgres databases, and needing to have one-click replication, one-click recovery, those kinds of things. So they've hired developers that a lot of them have contributed to the core Postgres project.
Sure.
For the purpose of making Postgres better, because they realize these shortcomings now that it needs to really support that kind of integration. And so that's why there have been a number of updates in the last 2, 3, 4 releases. You can just see it happening, right?
Getting better.
We're getting incremental backups finally.
And I
Why?
love it. Well, I
because
love it. I mean, it's so I'm saying it's SQL Server's got there's a maturity to SQL Server. I mean, even though it's not a whole lot older than Postgres, really. It's a little bit, but there's a maturity to it from an administrative. HADR,
what else? You had another area,
from
right?
the scale of backups.
Backups, yeah. Because I was going to ask about log shipping, but what about backups? What do you say? Right, like SQL Server is rock solid backups,
I get so
amazing.
Angry at Postgres for backups because SQL Server's backups are amazing, and I didn't know SQL Server's backups were amazing until I had to learn Postgres's backups, and then I'm going, I have to do what? I have to do what?
It's like me doing dumps in MySQL and Oracle.
Dumps in MySQL. I don't even want to talk about MySQL. But the point-in-time restore process, to restore to a point in time, I have to put a file named a particular thing into a particular location, empty file, so that it can get renamed.
You have to stand on one foot and wave
along. And you have to put the point in time you want to restore in the config file.
Yes. You have to change your configuration file.
Yeah.
It's
insane, right?
The crazy part is
makes me crazy.
Again, it does work.
Oh, it works.
And it works.
It works.
It just works.
If you do it right.
If you do it right.
Yeah, if you get it right.
And you have all the things in the right place, you've copied the files correctly and do the stuff. All those things, I think, again, we don't have incremental backups still. There's just no such thing. You do a point in time backup.
So you don't have log shipping, you don't have an equivalent of log shipping, right?
Well, yes, we do, and that's part of point in time. So it's wall. So you're basically you're archiving the wall, which is a very similar thing.
You can archive the wall, and then you can play back the wall in another location. So it's effective.
Yep. It is log shipping. Okay. All right.
But so the actual backup project. So we have a dump. You can do like that transactional point in time dump. But the actual backup is file level backup, like the actual files, right?
Yeah.
And then they just have never, it's like no one could agree on how to do incremental. Well, someone finally, and he's been a long time contributor, if I said, I'm tired of this, and in Postgres 17, it would be the first time that we will have opportunity to do incremental backups. Not at your desk, like this isn't I can take a backup and then just do incremental, not like that, which again, I can do in SQL Server, depending on what I'm doing. But with the commands at the server level, I can finally do incrementals.
You do that. Okay.
And that's another simplification,
Right.
which makes
And
the
then
thing
that's great.
easier.
I mean, that's what I'm saying. I love both tools, and I love both tools for different reasons. But boy, I mean, the backup thing. Oh.
Backup thing. Okay. I have another one.
Yeah.
SQL agent.
Oh man, you're hitting it all, aren't you?
No, I'm not beating on.
I know,
I'm a
you're
little
right.
bit of understanding,
Yeah.
right? The things that I care about.
Yeah, there is nothing like SQL agent.
So you have to roll your own.
in
It's
the
like
base.
Windows scripting or Bash scripting.
So,
right?
Cron,
there-
or, I mean,
Right, there are a couple of
actually,
extensions
I think
that are
Agent's
really.
overrated. I hate Agent, honestly. I found it totally
So
pain in the ass.
convenient.
Oh, it's so convenient.
It's
And it-
Like
convenient,
it's got
yeah.
problems.
But Cron's right there in Linux. I mean,
Cron
Well,
is-
so what?
Cron is nuts.
Again, what most people, and so this is the other part about extensions is there are 1,000 or more of them.
sure.
There are only about 50 to 75 that are very popular, used all the
Right.
time, have a very, a useful
Stable.
implementation in some way, and they're stable. And so when you go to the big 3 or 4 database providers, they each have their own set of approved extensions because you have to have access to the server to install the code base of the extension
Okay.
to then use it. So you don't in Azure, you don't in RDS. They have to approve them.
RDS is actively building
They are
a
trusted data, trusted.
scheduler.
I forget what it's called, but it's I forget the exact name, but it's
Oh,
basically
TLE, Trusted Language Extension. Oh
Yes,
my goodness.
it's a way to make your
Yeah.
extension trusted by AWS, so that you can put any extension in there if you code it correctly.
Correct.
So like the App Store, but it'd be App Store for Postgres, kind of. Right?
Kind of,
Like you
yeah,
can
yeah.
add those
Yeah,
things.
that's kind of like that. So I said
It's
all
not
that
there yet.
because there are primarily two extensions that are well known, well used for the agent
Scheduling,
job stuff.
okay. All
And
right.
so they are accessible, and the biggest one is PG Cron.
Okay.
So it's a database level thing. It doesn't have the user interface. It doesn't have the dialogue. You have to know how to. Documentation's good, but
All right. So two more
so you
things.
can get it.
Patching. How does the patching process? Is it good, bad, random,
Patching-
schedule, right? Like so in SQL Server, right? So just clear, Microsoft has moved from service packs once or twice a year or less, less sometimes, to every other month-ish patches on a regular basis, so that we know as there are bug fixes or security issues or something else, we will roll things out on this cadence.
Gotcha.
Right, and there's always two trains, so there's an RTM train, right, for the base version, 15, 16, 14, whatever. And then there's a current version for security patches as well. How does that work in Postgres? Do you think good, better?
What I like about Postgres is that the schedule is very predictable. And
Okay.
that has been something that's happened for 25 years. The team that develops across the world that contribute code, it's probably 20 years ago, they came up with a scheme that said, look, we are going to set up what they call commit fests.
Okay.
And so it's published ahead of time. We know that. So it's basically 5 times a year.
Oh.
They have it happens in, I think, January, March, and then I think the March one ends up being 3 months to the end of June, because that's when they're deciding what's going to go into the next version. And the next version's released usually in September or early October. And so there's 5 total, and at the end of every commit fest, there's a minor release for all the versions that are currently supported. So you know something's coming. And if there is a real big security issue, they will do an immediate release. If
Okay.
something
So
needs it.
that's about equivalent then. It's about the
Yeah.
same thing.
It's about the same thing.
Yeah. Because I think Microsoft probably.
running the updates is real easy.
It is.
Yeah.
And-
Because I think
I mean,
Microsoft.
it's like sudo apt-get update, sudo apt-get.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right,
when
I
it's
mean,
that kind of
it's-
stuff for sure. And
Yeah.
again, all the
It's-
providers have a way to do it immediately. Now, going from major version to major version,
Yeah, it's upgraded.
Yeah.
it's
Different-
it's
yeah,
still
that's
that's a little bit more of a hassle.
Yeah, yeah.
But
and
same
getting
with
better.
fine. Same with
Server.
SQL Server.
Yeah, I mean,
Can I roll back patches?
Ooh.
I don't know.
Because we
So,
can't
okay.
SQL Server.
So technically you can't. However, they guarantee there's no catalog schema changes within a version. So if something wasn't good, you could basically set up a quickly install a new version, point to the old data, and it would work within that. So if I'm on Postgres 16, I install.
I wouldn't have to back up or restore, just point to the files, right?
Basically point to the files, and it would keep running. There's nothing's going to happen there.
I
The-
honestly
but-
believe it too. 'Cause
But the other thing
they
that's
do a
really
good job
interesting,
in that area.
this is the unique part.
Right.
And to understand this part is the CommitFest is public. Anybody in the world can go to commitfest.postgresql.org. And it's a web app. It's a very simple web app. But it lists every in-flight patch that's being considered for the next point release
Right.
or the next version. And then you can click. Now, it is still old school. Everything's still handled via mailing list.
Right.
But you can click on the link and you can see, in some cases, years of discussion over this patch or this new feature and how they got to it. So there's no surprises when something happens in any of the releases. And that's unique, right? Microsoft, generally, you don't know what they're going to release
Oh yeah,
as a
you
new
really,
feature. You
really
might hear
don't.
about it, you
I
might...
mean,
You don't, but as a practical sense for most of us, right? Like we're not clicking through the commit fest to see what's
totally
up,
get
right?
that.
Like
No,
we
that
just
makes
don't
sense.
care.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
all right. So maybe the last thing, because I think this has come up recently in SQL Server a little bit too, is that in Postgres you have I can go download Postgres from PostgreSQL.org, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can get the Docker container. I can go to
I'm
RDS.
going to just correct that there. It's not PostgreSQL. It's PostgreSQL. I hate it anyway. Just say Postgres.
Whatever.
I get it right. I'm just saying. It's not that hard. PostgreSQL.
Sorry.
It's easy.
I call it whatever I want.
You call it whatever you want.
But there's RDS, right?
Yeah.
So in the AWS space, I have RDS, I have Aurora, I have
Mm-hmm.
Redshift. Right in the Google space, I have AlloyDB and Spanner.
Yep.
I think it's based on that. You know, we have Azure, Postgres. So I have Yugabyte, I have PlanetScale. I have all these versions. Is that a challenge or is that an advantage that you see when I'm working with Postgres to have, because they're close, but they're not quite there. They're not the same. And so I just wonder, from somebody that does Postgres, you have not just a choice of saying I'm using Postgres, but which flavor and where, right? And sometimes that where might determine flavors as well.
Capability, I would say more than flavor, but yeah.
Right, but RDS, Aurora, similar, right? Redshift different, but based, right?
Well, so
Redshift. I wouldn't.
Redshift's different, right?
Yeah,
It's different.
Redshift is based on.
But language-wise and stuff, there's a lot of stuff that's
There's a lot of
similar,
similarities.
right?
There's a lot of similarities.
So I'm just curious, right? Because in the SQL space, we've mostly just had one version at a time, right, of a release, right, 14, 15, whatever. But now we have Azure SQL Database, we have MI, we have Edge. They're slightly different, and that causes some issues, right? We have Synapse again, which is a SQL Server-ish thing.
Something like timescale is just different. It's standard Postgres plus, and so even with something like SQL Monitor, we now support a lot in Postgres, and we're doing a lot with Postgres and SQL Monitor to make even something like replication easier to monitor.
Sure.
But being able to monitor specific stuff about timescale or transitioning, there's things that are just different, and it's not going to work.
Right.
And so, just asking those questions up front. Where are you hosting your database? And they say RDS, like, okay, RDS is Postgres.
I'm less about effective. I'm thinking about you as a Postgres person. Do you think it's good or bad? Do you like it? Or do you think it adds overhead, or does it create confusion, right? Like, if we compare it, right? Because Oracle's Oracle.
Yeah.
Like Oracle's Oracle.
So here's maybe a better way to answer that. If I'm in the forums a lot at the Slack channel for Postgres, and inevitably, probably 60 or 70% of the questions end up being RDS questions. And inevitably, the SQL, the Postgres contributors, like, go talk to AWS.
Yeah,
That's
it's different. It's different. It's not our
something
thing.
is different about that.
Yeah.
The storage is different. The query layer is exactly the same. The query engine is exactly the same, but the storage layer is different, and so that might change the thing that you're asking about. And so I think, again, that's what, Yugabyte, same deal. The query layer is essentially the same thing, but the storage is completely different. And so it just doesn't work the same way. And
So it causes some problems.
It does, because you start answering a question, you have no idea, I wish you would have told me you were using X. That changes how we think about this answer and how we think about helping you. So
because as somebody just getting going in it, I mean, and I know I've been in it for 2 years, but I still feel like I'm barely scratching the surface.
Right.
The internals across Azure, AWS, Google, for Postgres and containers seem the same to me, man, because all the code that I've been running and doing stuff with over and over and over again across all these platforms has just kept working.
It does. So that's the great part of it is like 98% of anything you would normally do in just normal Postgres will just work. The problem becomes like Yugabyte, because it's a distributed version of Postgres, distributed transactions don't work like you would expect a transaction to work. So they don't support like maybe that specific kind of transaction thing, but you don't realize it until you say, begin transaction, do thing. Like, no, we don't do that. Like, oh, okay. And same thing for even Azure, AlloyDB, just depending where you go, there's that one or two little things that you don't know until you.
Very different. I mean, that one's.
Well, Alloy's very different. I'm talking to the team recently, and they claim 100% compatibility with all Postgres code. And again, they're doing all the stuff under the covers.
Right.
They add a column store index automatically, right?
Oh,
they
wow.
have that's
Okay.
yeah.
Huh.
It's a challenge. It's a challenge to know even how sometimes just that in and of itself. Oh, you're using Alloy. Do you realize this other thing might help what you're trying to accomplish it this way, but it turns out they have implemented this thing that actually would help you better if you just do it.
Well, I mean, and that's the fun thing about. I mean, that's one of the fun things I love about Postgres is that extensibility, because it really does enhance what we can do. Mm-hmm. The issue that you run into though is if you're trying to do bog standard Postgres and you're like doing searches online, for example, you're going to get answers and you're going to go, oh, cool, that's exactly what I need. And you're not going to realize the code you're looking at is for an extension until you start running it and going like, why is it telling me that object doesn't exist?
Yeah.
What the heck?
So, I mean, it sounds like, there's a lot of advantages to the wide variety of Postgres and things, but there's some challenges because it becomes more complicated to work with it. Do you think that's a challenge in an organization that might have multiple flavors as well? Like it gets difficult for people to move across projects, or is most of the work just too close to vanilla that's not a big deal?
I think most is too close to
Most
vanilla.
too close.
I was going to say most is too close to vanilla.
It's always going to be the edge thing, right? The edge case you don't realize is different until you hit it and like, okay.
Especially when we're talking about the cloud, the other issue you're going to run into real quick on the cloud is you can do dumps, sure,
right?
But backups and point-in-time recovery, that's handled for you.
Same in SQL Server for the most
part.
part.
Well, and exactly the same in SQL Server, right? I mean, but I mean, it's the good thing about the cloud is that backups are handled. You don't have to worry about that. Bad thing about the cloud is they're handling your backups, which is makes people scared. And I get why. And I'm 100% behind what you maybe want to be a little nervous, but basically that's something you kind of surrender.
Yeah.
And at least in the case of Postgres, yay, because backups.
I think it's just interesting to see that in this day and age where we are, there's an opportunity, and I think Microsoft is. I know you've talked like they understand that there's some things they can learn from.
I love what they're doing,
and so there's a lot of things that they're adding. Like that's awesome. I'm glad that that's coming around, right? But having a tool. It's what we've kind of said this whole time, a flexible tool that can really help you accomplish something unique in a way that's supported, right? Because you have access to all these extensions on all these major platforms, and they then will support you in it. It just allows some really cool things. There's a new company called Tempo IO, and their whole goal is basically create stacks, basically, for lack of a better term, like a Docker file that creates Postgres for specific purpose, geospatial, time series, right? So you don't have to think about it. We're just going to give it to you. We'll handle upgrades. We'll handle and.
I thought SQL Server should do that for a while because we've had Stream Insight, right? We have temporal stuff, right? We have a lot of these features they've kind of half added, right? Both in the tooling and the capability feature, and then they've not found it worthwhile to continue adding them, right? Which is where I miss kind of like
the whole in-memory thing,
plug-in thing that would be useful, right?
The in-memory thing, I would love to see more work done on that. It's a great tool in certain
certain cases.
It's a kind of a niche tool, But if you're in that niche, holy crap, that thing is amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
But then they've kind of dropped work on it, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the downside, I think, of one vendor doing it. On the plus side, our tooling, our HA, our administration, some of that stuff is
Those
just
things.
Oh, yeah, just
fantastic.
rock solid.
Right?
Oh yeah.
And it continues to get
trust.
better. So.
So, just the last thing, because we certainly need to wrap this up. But
Okay.
I think we've
Yeah.
been talking quite a
We're having
while.
fun.
This is fun. It's just learning, right? So you
Yeah.
and I were on a podcast a year ago.
Yeah, a year ago.
It's been renamed. The new episode is just called Talking Postgres with Claire Giordano. She's with Microsoft, and they've been doing this podcast for the last year and a half or so. And just finding places. So we're working on this book to help beginners make that transition, just kind of intro knowledge in all the various areas to get you a starting place with Postgres. We're starting to, I'm offering some training through Redgate.
Oh, cool.
As that various places I think will show up just to help in that transition from a SQL Server perspective. It's just a day of how can we just change your terminology understanding just so you have a place to start with.
Oh, and I write a series of articles
And you
called
write a series of
Learning with
articles.
Grant, Learning Postgres with Grant.
Yep.
Yeah. Learning PostgreSQL with Grant.
PostgreSQL, I like that. That's good.
And I do nothing with Postgres. I do a little bit, but I don't really talk about much.
Yeah, and there are certainly other places, but again, just a couple quick places to start. We're going to be doing a pre-con at Past Summit.
Yep.
That is based on the book, so it'd be a great way to, again, just get your first intro to Postgres if you haven't been using it.
Get your feet wet.
Yeah.
And avoid a lot of pain. I mean,
Yeah.
learning new technology is always hard, right? I mean, it always is. But learning Postgres has just got a couple of wrinkles in there. Especially if you're coming from SQL Server, that hurt me while I was trying to learn it. But I mean, once you get over it, it's great. But
Yep.
there was just some pain points that you can avoid.
Absolutely. All right, well,
All right.
good first conversation. I feel like go on this for quite a while.
Oh no, yeah, I could keep
There's
going.
a
Yeah,
lot happening.
we should do some future
We-
episodes on
we-
specific
Yeah.
things.
Yeah,
and
because we
areas,
could really
but-
drill down on some amazing stuff that both tools do. I mean,
Yeah, for sure.
But hopefully you've enjoyed this and you learned a little bit about Postgres. If you want to know more, reach out to us. Check out Simple Talk. There's plenty of articles there as well. And certainly, if you're at any events like the Past Summit or somewhere else, please come say hi to us. We'd love to meet you.
and I need a big hat.
And we get granted a big hat. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.